The slap didn't echo the loudest thing in that mall, the silence that followed did. Stay with me, because what happened in the next 8 seconds turned a routine Saturday afternoon into the moment a powerful man lost everything. The Galleria at Westfield Plaza was the kind of place where everything gleamed, polished marble floors reflecting rows of designer storefronts, the air scented with expensive perfume and roasted coffee drifting from a cafe on the second level. Shoppers moved in slow, comfortable patterns, bags in hand, voices low, lives predictable. And then everything stopped. Phones paused mid-scroll. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Even the background music seemed to fade into something distant and unreal. In the center of it all stood Emily Carter, 7 months pregnant, her hand resting protectively over the gentle curve of her belly, her breathing shallow, uneven. Her dress was simple, soft blue, the kind that didn't belong in a place built on status and image, but it fit her in a way that suggested something stronger than wealth, quiet dignity. Across from her stood Richard Hayes, a man whose name opened doors and closed deals, whose tailored suit fit like armor, whose expression had always been described as composed, controlled, untouchable. Next to him, Vanessa Cole leaned slightly forward, her posture sharp, her smile thin and precise, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. She said something then, quiet, but sharp enough to cut through the stillness, and Emily's fingers tightened slightly against her own arm, as if bracing against something invisible. No one moved. No one spoke. But dozens of cameras were already lifted, tiny red recording lights blinking to life like a constellation forming in real time. What no one noticed, not yet, was the man standing just 10 feet away, dressed in a standard mall security uniform, posture relaxed but eyes fixed, unblinking. He didn't react like the others. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't step forward. He simply watched. The overhead lights cast a cold, even glow across the scene, turning every expression into something sharper, more defined. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders barely rising, as if she understood something no one else did. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, a small, habitual motion, like he was resetting the moment back into his control. Vanessa crossed her arms, waiting, confident, certain of how this would end. And still, the silence held. It stretched, thick and heavy, pressing against every person in that space, turning curiosity into tension. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed, unaware. A coffee cup clinked against porcelain. Life tried to continue, but it couldn't quite break through. Because something was about to shift. Something no one in that mall, no matter how powerful, how wealthy, how prepared, had seen coming. And the man in the security uniform finally moved his hand to his earpiece. The man in the security uniform did not rush, did not raise his voice, did not draw attention to himself, and that was exactly why the shift felt so unsettling as his fingers pressed lightly against the small earpiece hidden beneath his collar, and he spoke in a tone so calm it barely registered above the silence. Lock all exits. At first, nothing seemed to happen, and for a fraction of a second, it almost felt like the moment might dissolve, like the tension would break and everyone would go back to pretending they had not just witnessed something they could not explain. But then a soft mechanical click echoed from somewhere above, followed by another, and another, until the subtle sound of sliding security gates began to ripple through the mall like a controlled wave. Distant at first, then unmistakable. People turned their heads, confusion replacing curiosity, as storefront grills lowered halfway and glass doors at the main entrances sealed with quiet precision, not chaotic, not loud, just deliberate. Richard noticed it next, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced toward the nearest exit, calculating, always calculating, while Vanessa shifted her weight, her confidence flickering just enough to betray uncertainty. Emily did not move. She stood exactly where she had been, her breathing steadier now, her gaze no longer searching but fixed, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. Around them, whispers began to form, low and scattered, questions without answers, as more phones lifted, capturing not just the scene, but the strange, controlled transformation of the environment itself. The man in the uniform took a single step forward, then another, closing the distance with an ease that did not match the role he appeared to play. Up close, the details became clearer. The uniform was correct, but the way he wore it was not. The posture was too straight, the presence too grounded, the eyes too focused. This was not someone reacting to a situation. This was someone directing it. He reached up slowly and removed the earpiece, letting it fall into his palm, his gaze never leaving Richard. "Sir?" he said, and the word carried a weight that did not belong to a mall employee. Richard straightened instinctively, the subtle reflex of a man used to authority, yet suddenly unsure where he stood within it. "What is going on here?" he asked, his voice controlled, but tighter now, less certain than before. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering how much to reveal, then glanced briefly at Emily, and in that glance, something shifted again, something deeper, something that rewrote the entire scene without a single dramatic gesture. Emily met his eyes, and for the first time since the moment began, her expression softened, not with relief, but with recognition. The man turned back, his voice lower now, steadier, final. "What is going on?" he said. "Is that you chose the wrong moment, in the wrong place, with the wrong person?" The words did not rise, did not sharpen, but they landed with a precision that cut through every remaining layer of uncertainty. Somewhere behind them, a large digital display flickered, then came to life, cycling away from advertisements into a live feed, frozen on a frame that everyone in the mall had just witnessed from their own perspective, now captured, centered, undeniable. The crowd shifted again, no longer passive, no longer just watching, but understanding that this was no longer an isolated moment. This was something being recorded, contained, and about to be revealed. And Richard Hayes, for the first time in years, did not look like the man in control. The screen above them sharpened into focus, and for a moment no one breathed as the frozen frame transitioned into motion, replaying the last 60 seconds from a perfect overhead angle, every movement clear, every expression impossible to deny, the kind of footage that did not need narration because it spoke in its own undeniable language. And as it played, the crowd shifted again, no longer uncertain, no longer guessing, but witnessing something that could not be explained away or reinterpreted. Vanessa took a small step back, her arms uncrossing without her realizing it, her eyes darting from the screen to Richard and then back again as if searching for a version of reality where she still had control, but the moment had already moved past her. Richard's jaw tightened, his posture rigid now, his mind racing through options, strategies, exits that no longer existed because every door in that building was sealed and every eye was now turned toward him, not with admiration, not with curiosity, but with something far more dangerous, recognition. The man in the security uniform remained still for another second, letting the weight of the moment settle fully before he reached up and slowly removed the badge from his chest, not tossing it aside, not making a show of it, just holding it briefly in his hand as if it had served its purpose. Then he spoke again, and this time his voice carried, not louder, but deeper, reaching every corner of the space without effort. "My name is William Carter." The name did not land immediately, not for everyone, but for those who understood, who followed markets, who read headlines, who recognized power when they heard it. The reaction was instant, a ripple of realization moving through the crowd like a current. Phones lifted higher. Whispers sharpened into gasps. William Carter, the man who did not appear in public, the man who built companies instead of attending galas, the man whose influence stretched quietly but completely across industries most people did not even understand. And now he stood there in a mall security uniform. Richard blinked once, then again, as if trying to reset what he was seeing into something logical, but nothing about this was logical anymore. "That is not possible," he said, but the words lacked conviction, already collapsing under their own weight. William did not respond to the denial. He simply turned slightly, angling his body toward Emily, his expression softening in a way that did not match the authority he had just revealed. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the question was simple, almost quiet, but it carried more presence than anything else that had been said. Emily nodded once, a small movement, but steady, her hand still resting over her belly, her eyes clear now, no longer uncertain, no longer searching. William gave the slightest nod in return, as if confirming something only the two of them understood, before turning back to Richard. "You built your reputation on control," William said, his tone measured, precise. "On the belief that you could shape outcomes, manage perceptions, decide what matters and what does not." He paused, just long enough for the words to settle. "Today, you miscalculated." Behind them, the screen shifted again, now displaying not just the footage, but timestamps, angles, multiple perspectives stitched together into a narrative that required no interpretation, and the crowd responded accordingly, their silence transforming into something heavier, something that pressed inward rather than holding back. Security personnel, real security personnel, moved quietly along the edges, not aggressive, not rushed, but present in a way that made it clear the situation was no longer fluid. Vanessa shook her head slightly, her voice breaking the silence but not the control. "This is insane," she said, but even she sounded like she did not believe it. William did not look at her. He did not need to. His focus remained exactly where it had been from the start. On the man who had just realized that power, real power, did not announce itself until it was already in place. And by then, it was too late to change anything. For a long second, no one spoke, because the shift had already happened and everyone could feel it, that invisible line where a situation stops being uncertain and becomes irreversible, and Richard Hayes stood exactly on the wrong side of it, his usual confidence now replaced by something tighter, something calculating but no longer effective. Because calculation only works when there are variables left to control, and in this moment there were none. The screen above continued to play, not repeating but expanding, pulling in new angles, timestamps aligning with quiet precision, showing how every second had been captured, documented, secured long before anyone realized what was unfolding, and the realization spread through the crowd like a slow wave. This was not reaction, this was preparation. William Carter stepped slightly to the side, not retreating, not advancing, simply repositioning himself in a way that made it clear he was not alone in this, and almost immediately, two individuals in plain dark suits appeared at the edge of the scene, their presence subtle but unmistakable, the kind of presence that did not need introduction. One of them spoke quietly into a device, and within seconds, uniformed officers entered from a side corridor, their pace steady, their expressions neutral, not aggressive, not hesitant, simply executing a process that had already been set in motion. Vanessa's composure finally cracked, her voice rising just enough to break the controlled atmosphere. "You cannot do this, you cannot just shut everything down like this." But even as she spoke, her words felt disconnected from reality, because everything around her was already responding to a different authority, one she could not influence. Richard exhaled slowly, forcing himself to straighten, to reclaim something of the man he had always been, the one who negotiated, who redirected, who turned pressure into advantage. But as he opened his mouth to speak, the officer closest to him stepped forward, not touching him, not restraining him, just positioning himself in a way that made the next steps clear without a single word. "Mr. Hayes," the officer said, calm, professional, "we need you to come with us." It was not a question. It was not a threat. It was simply the next step. Richard glanced once more at William, searching for leverage, for recognition, for some unspoken understanding between men of influence. But William's expression did not change, because this was not negotiation, this was consequence. Emily shifted her weight slightly, her hands still resting over her belly, and for the first time since the moment began, she took a small step forward, not toward Richard, not toward the officers, but simply forward, as if reclaiming space that had been taken from her long before today. The movement was quiet, almost invisible, but it carried a weight that drew the attention of everyone watching, because it was not driven by anger or fear, it was driven by something steadier, something resolved. The large screen dimmed slightly, the footage fading into a still image, frozen at a moment that would not need explanation, and around them, the crowd began to shift again, no longer just witnesses, but participants in a moment that would be replayed, discussed, shared far beyond the walls of that mall. Phones lowered slowly, not because the interest was gone, but because the outcome was already understood. William turned his head just slightly toward Emily again, not speaking this time, just acknowledging, and she met that glance with a calm that had replaced everything that came before. Behind them, the doors remained locked, the exits sealed, not as a barrier, but as a statement, because sometimes the most powerful message is not in what is said, but in what is no longer allowed to be avoided. Richard did not resist, not because he accepted what was happening, but because somewhere beneath the surface he understood that resistance would only make the moment worse, more visible, more permanent, and visibility was now the one thing he could not control, so he adjusted his posture one last time, as if presentation still mattered, and allowed the officers to guide him forward through a path that seemed to open on its own as the crowd instinctively stepped back, creating space not out of respect, but out of recognition that they were witnessing the collapse of something they had once believed untouchable. Vanessa remained where she stood for a second longer, her mind clearly trying to reorganize a reality that no longer aligned with her expectations, her eyes scanning the faces around her, searching for support, for agreement, for anything that would confirm this was temporary, reversible, but what she found instead was distance, people turning slightly away, conversations beginning in low tones that did not include her. And for the first time since she had stepped into that mall, she looked alone. The large screen above dimmed further, transitioning away from the footage into a simple black background, but the image it had shown remained fixed in the minds of everyone present, replaying without effort, because moments like that did not need screens to survive. Emily exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to release something deeper than tension, something that had been building long before today, and she lowered her hand slightly from her belly, not because she needed to protect it less, but because she no longer felt like she was standing in danger. William watched the movement carefully, not intervening, not directing, simply present in the way that mattered most, and after a brief pause, he stepped closer, closing the distance that had existed between them throughout the entire scene. "You handled yourself well," he said quietly, his voice no longer carrying across the mall, no longer intended for anyone but her. Emily gave a small nod, her eyes steady, her expression calm in a way that suggested she had already moved past the moment, already placed it behind her even as the world around her continued to process it. Around them, the controlled tension began to ease, not disappearing, but shifting into something more structured, more orderly, as the officers completed their task and the plainclothes security team coordinated with mall management, quiet conversations replacing the earlier silence. One by one, the security gates began to lift again, the soft mechanical hum returning, restoring access, restoring movement, but not restoring what had just been lost. People began to walk again, slowly at first, then more naturally, though many still glanced back, still checked their phones, still held on to the awareness that they had just seen something rare, something real, something that would not fade quickly. Vanessa turned at last, her posture no longer sharp, her confidence no longer intact, and without a word, she walked toward the nearest open corridor, disappearing into the flow of people who no longer paid her any attention. William placed a light hand on Emily's shoulder, not guiding, not steering, just anchoring, and together they began to walk in the opposite direction, away from the center, away from the cameras, away from the moment that had already done its work. Emily did not look back. She did not need to. Because some endings do not require confirmation, they simply settle into place, quiet and final, leaving nothing behind but the space where something once stood and the understanding that it will never stand there again. By the time they reached the quieter corridor near the private exits, the noise of the mall had returned to something almost normal, but it was not the same normal that had existed an hour ago. It was thinner, more aware, as if the entire building had absorbed what had happened and would carry it in every reflection of glass and marble for days to come. Emily walked steadily, each step measured, her breathing even, her shoulders relaxed in a way that had not been possible before, and beside her William matched her pace without saying anything, because sometimes silence was the only language that fit a moment that had already said everything it needed to say. A discreet black SUV waited at the curb outside, engine running, the driver stepping out the moment he saw them approach, opening the rear door without a word, his movements efficient, practiced, part of a system that did not require explanation. Emily paused just before stepping in, her gaze drifting briefly across the parking area, not searching, not hesitant, just taking in the space as it existed now, calm, ordinary, almost unremarkable, and for a second it was hard to believe that something so decisive had just taken place only a few hundred feet away. William watched her carefully, not interrupting, giving her the space to finish whatever thought had not yet fully formed, and when she finally turned toward him, there was no trace of the earlier tension in her expression, only clarity. "It is over," she said quietly, not as a question, not even as a statement that required confirmation, but as something she had already accepted. William nodded once, his expression steady. "Yes," he replied, just as quietly. "It is." She took a slow breath, then placed a hand gently over her belly again, not out of fear, but out of connection, a small, grounding gesture that carried more meaning than anything spoken inside that mall. "Then we move forward," she said. William allowed the faintest hint of a smile, not pride, not relief, just acknowledgement. "We always do." She stepped into the vehicle, settling into the seat as the door closed softly behind her, sealing off the outside world in a way that felt controlled, intentional, safe. William followed, taking the seat beside her, and with a subtle nod to the driver, the vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the flow of traffic as if it had always belonged there. Behind them, the mall continued its day, stores reopening fully, music returning to its usual volume, people resuming routines that felt slightly different now, shaped by what they had witnessed whether they realized it or not. Somewhere inside, screens would eventually return to advertisements, floors would be polished again, and conversations would shift to other topics, but the memory of that moment would remain, carried in phones, in stories, in quiet retellings that would spread far beyond that building. Inside the car, Emily leaned back slightly, her eyes closing for just a second, not from exhaustion, but from release, the kind that comes when something unresolved finally reaches its end. William looked out the window, his reflection faint in the glass, the city moving past in steady lines, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to add. Some lessons do not need to be explained. Some consequences do not need to be announced. And some men only understand the value of dignity when the world finally refuses to let them ignore it. The city moved on the way it always did. Indifferent on the surface yet quietly shaped by moments no one could fully measure, and as the black SUV glided through late afternoon traffic, sunlight stretching across glass buildings and long shadows forming along the streets, Emily opened her eyes again, this time not to check her surroundings, but simply to take them in without tension, without anticipation of what might go wrong next. The rhythm of the road was steady, predictable, almost comforting, and for the first time in months, maybe longer, she allowed herself to sit without calculating the next conversation, the next compromise, the next silent endurance. William remained beside her, his presence grounded, unobtrusive, not asking questions he already knew the answers to, not offering reassurances she did not need, because what had happened was not something that required comfort, it required acknowledgement, and that had already been given. Outside, the city shifted from retail districts into quieter residential streets lined with trees just beginning to show the first hints of seasonal change, leaves catching light in a way that made everything feel slightly softer, less rigid. Emily watched it all pass by, her hand resting lightly against her belly again, feeling the subtle movement within, a reminder that her story was not defined by what had just ended, but by what was still continuing. "He thought it would stay hidden," she said after a while, her voice calm, reflective, not bitter. William turned his head slightly, listening. "They always do," he replied, not as judgment, but as observation, a pattern he had seen too many times in different forms, in different places, across different lives. Emily nodded faintly, her gaze still on the window. "But it never does," she added. William did not answer immediately, because the truth of that did not need reinforcement, and after a moment he simply said, "Not when it matters." The vehicle slowed as it approached a long private drive, iron gates opening smoothly ahead of them without pause, recognizing the car before it even reached the entrance, and as they passed through, the noise of the city faded almost instantly, replaced by a quiet that felt intentional, designed, protected. The house beyond was expansive but understated, set back among tall trees and open lawn, the kind of place that did not need to announce its value because it existed beyond comparison. The car came to a gentle stop, and the driver stepped out once more, opening the door with the same quiet efficiency as before. Emily stepped out carefully, adjusting her balance with ease, her posture strong, steady, and as her feet touched the ground, there was a subtle shift, not in the world around her, but in the way she occupied it. She was no longer reacting. She was choosing. William joined her, standing just slightly behind, not leading, not following, simply present as she looked toward the house, then back briefly at the open gates behind them. For a second, the outside world was still visible, the road, the distance, everything that had led to this moment, and then the gates began to close again, slowly, quietly, sealing off what had already been left behind. Emily did not watch them shut. She turned forward instead, taking a step toward the entrance, her pace unhurried, her expression clear, and as she moved, the space around her seemed to settle into something new, something stable, something earned. Because in the end, it was never about the moment everyone saw. It was about what remained after it passed, and what remained now was not fear, not doubt, not silence. It was control, finally placed in the right hands. The house felt different once the doors closed behind them, not because it had changed, but because Emily had, and the difference settled into every quiet corner of the space as she walked slowly across the polished hardwood floors, the soft echo of her steps blending with the distant hum of a home that had always been secure, always been steady, but now felt personal in a way it had not before. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, stretching across the room in long, golden lines, catching dust particles that drifted lazily in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed suspended, not in tension, but in calm. William paused near the entrance, watching her move forward, not following immediately, allowing her to take the lead in a space that had always been hers by right, even when she had chosen to live elsewhere, even when she had believed she needed to build something separate, something independent, something that now felt less like freedom and more like distance from what had always protected her. Emily stopped near the center of the living room, her hand resting once again over her belly, her breathing slow, measured, grounded, and she turned slightly, taking in the room not as a guest, not as someone returning, but as someone reclaiming. "I forgot how quiet it is here," she said, her voice soft but steady. William stepped closer this time, his shoes barely making a sound against the floor. "It was always meant to be that way," he replied. "No noise you do not choose." She nodded faintly, understanding the meaning behind the words, not just the silence of the house, but the absence of chaos, of unpredictability, of having to brace for something that should never have been normal. A staff member appeared briefly at the edge of the room, respectful, unobtrusive, confirming that everything was prepared, that the guest suite had been adjusted, that medical support was on standby if needed, and Emily acknowledged it with a small nod before the figure disappeared again, the house returning to its quiet rhythm. She moved toward the large window overlooking the back garden, where the late afternoon light softened the edges of everything it touched, and beyond the glass, the world felt distant, contained, manageable. "It is strange," she said after a moment, her reflection faint in the window. "I thought today would feel heavier." William stood beside her now, his gaze following hers outward. "It was never about the weight," he said. "It was about the release." She let the words settle, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the glass, not in thought, but in presence, and then she smiled, not wide, not dramatic, just enough to shift the entire tone of the moment. "Then I think I understand it now," she said. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock chimed the hour, a soft, deliberate sound that marked time without urgency, and for the first time in a long while, time did not feel like something she was trying to keep up with or escape from. It simply moved, and she moved with it. William glanced at her briefly, then toward the hallway leading further inside, where the future waited in small, practical steps, in decisions that would be made without pressure, without fear, without compromise. Emily turned from the window and began to walk in that direction, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, and as she passed through the space, the light followed her, stretching forward, illuminating the path ahead in a way that felt less like chance and more like certainty. Because sometimes the most powerful turning point is not the moment the world witnesses, but the quiet step that comes after, when everything has already shifted and all that remains is the choice to keep moving forward without looking back. The hallway opened into a quieter wing of the house, where the light softened and the sounds of the outside world faded almost completely, replaced by a stillness that felt intentional, as if every inch of the space had been designed to protect what mattered most. And as Emily walked through it, her steps remained steady, unhurried, her presence no longer shaped by reaction but by choice. A nurse greeted her near the doorway of the private suite, offering a gentle smile, professional and warm, confirming that everything was ready, that her vitals could be checked whenever she wished, that she could rest, sit, or simply exist without expectation, and Emily acknowledged her with a quiet thank you, her voice calm, her tone no longer carrying the subtle strain it once had. The room itself was filled with natural light, large windows overlooking a quiet garden where the wind moved softly through the trees, leaves shifting in slow patterns that required no attention but offered it anyway, a kind of quiet reassurance that life continued without urgency. Emily stepped inside and paused for a moment, taking in the space, the clean lines, the absence of noise, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed her shoulders to fully relax, not because she forced them to, but because there was nothing left pressing against them. She moved toward the chair by the window and sat down carefully, her hand resting once again over her belly, feeling the subtle movement within, steady, alive, unaffected by the chaos that had just ended, and that realization grounded her more than anything else could have. William remained near the doorway, not entering immediately, giving her the space to settle into the moment, to claim it without interruption, and when he finally stepped inside, his presence remained quiet, aligned with the tone of the room rather than disrupting it. "Everything is in place," he said, not as a report but as reassurance that the world outside had been handled, that nothing would follow them here unless invited. Emily nodded slowly, her gaze still directed toward the garden. "I know," she replied, and there was a certainty in her voice that did not require explanation. A tablet rested on the small table beside her, its screen dark for now, but waiting, holding updates, statements, reactions already beginning to spread across networks and platforms, the moment from the mall no longer contained, now moving outward into the broader world, but Emily did not reach for it. Not yet. Instead, she leaned back slightly, allowing herself a deeper breath, one that filled her lungs fully and released without hesitation, and as she did, something subtle shifted again, not externally, but within, the final layer of tension dissolving into something quieter, something resolved. William watched her for a second, then followed her gaze toward the garden, where the late afternoon light continued to soften, stretching shadows across the grass in long, gentle lines. "There will be noise," he said after a moment, his tone neutral, factual. "Questions, opinions, stories." Emily gave a faint smile, her eyes still calm. "There always is," she answered. "But not all of it matters." William inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth in that without adding to it, because she no longer needed guidance on what to hold on to, and what to let pass. Outside, a light breeze moved through the branches, leaves brushing softly against one another, a quiet, constant motion that did not demand attention but offered perspective, and Emily watched it for a few seconds longer before closing her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to settle, to anchor herself fully in a moment that was finally hers. Because in the end, the world would keep talking, it would replay, analyze, react, but the only thing that truly remained was what she chose to carry forward, and for the first time, that choice was entirely her own. The room remained quiet, but the world outside had already begun to accelerate, and even without looking at the screen beside her, Emily could feel it, the shift, the ripple effect of a moment that had broken containment and moved into public space where narratives form quickly and rarely wait for permission. After a while, she reached for the tablet, not out of urgency, but out of choice, her movements unhurried as she tapped the screen and brought it to life. Headlines were already forming, fragmented at first, then sharpening into something more cohesive. Words like Incident, footage, identity revealed. Appearing across multiple outlets, each trying to define what had happened before someone else did, and beneath them, the video itself, clipped, replayed, analyzed frame by people who had not been there but now spoke as if they had. Emily watched for a few seconds, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, as the moment she had just lived began to exist in a different form, flattened into pixels and commentary, stripped of the silence that had made it real. She set the tablet back down without scrolling further. "They are already turning it into something else," she said quietly. William leaned slightly against the edge of the table, his arms relaxed, his gaze not on the screen but on her. "They always do," he replied. "They will simplify it, reshape it, argue over it." Emily nodded once, her fingers resting lightly against the arm of the chair. "But they will never feel it the way it actually happened." William's expression softened just slightly, not in sympathy, but in agreement. "No," he said. "They will not." Outside, the light continued to shift, the sound lowering just enough to change the tone of the room, shadows lengthening across the floor, creating a sense of time passing that felt natural, not forced, and Emily let herself sit within it, not chasing the next step, not anticipating the next conversation, just allowing the present to exist without interruption. Somewhere deeper in the house, a quiet conversation between staff members carried faintly, then faded, the rhythm of life continuing in small, controlled ways that did not demand attention but supported it. "There will be statements," William said after a moment, his tone measured. "Legal responses, corporate distancing, attempts to control the narrative." Emily let out a slow breath, not tired but thoughtful. "And for the first time," she said, "none of that belongs to me." William inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the shift in ownership, in responsibility, in consequence. "No," he said. "It does not." She leaned back again, her gaze returning to the window, where the garden now carried a deeper tone of evening, colors softening, edges blurring slightly in the fading light, and there was something about that transition that felt aligned with everything that had just happened, not an ending, not a closing, but a change in state. Her hand moved once more to her belly, a quiet, instinctive gesture, and she felt a small movement in response, a reminder that while the world outside was reacting, analyzing, defining, something else continued unaffected, steady, growing, real. "That is what matters," she said softly, almost to herself. William did not ask what she meant. He did not need to. Because some truths do not require explanation, they reveal themselves in what is protected, in what is carried forward, in what remains untouched by everything that tries to reshape it. And as the room settled into the calm of early evening, the noise of the outside world felt further away, not because it had diminished, but because it no longer held the same weight, no longer defined the moment, no longer dictated what came next. The evening settled deeper into the house, the light outside dimming into a soft blue-gray that blurred the edges of the garden and turned the windows into faint mirrors, reflecting a quieter version of the room back onto itself, and Emily remained seated for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but because she understood something now that she had not allowed herself to understand before, that stillness was not weakness. It was control, and for the first time, it belonged entirely to her. She stood slowly, adjusting her balance with ease, her movements deliberate, grounded, and as she crossed the room, the space seemed to follow her rhythm, not demanding anything, not resisting, simply allowing her to exist within it on her own terms. William watched from where he stood, his presence unchanged, steady, observant, and as she reached the doorway leading further into the private wing, he spoke again, his voice low, measured. "There will be people who try to reach you," he said. "Apologies, explanations, requests." Emily paused, her hand resting lightly against the frame of the door, not turning yet. "And what would you suggest?" she asked, not because she needed instruction, but because she wanted to hear the answer spoken out loud. William did not hesitate. "That you do not respond to any of them until you decide they deserve it." Emily let a small breath out, something between a quiet laugh and acknowledgement, then nodded once. "That sounds right." She stepped into a hallway, the lighting softer here, designed for rest rather than display, and continued forward, each step carrying less weight than the one before, as if she were leaving something behind with every movement, something that no longer belonged to her. A mirror along the wall caught her reflection as she passed, and for a brief second, she slowed, not out of vanity, but recognition, seeing herself clearly, not as she had been seen in that mall, not as she would be seen on screens, but as she actually was in this moment, composed, present, unchanged in the ways that mattered. She held that image for a second, then continued on, not needing to question it further. In another part of the house, the low hum of preparation continued, dinner being set, lights adjusted, small details handled with quiet precision, the kind of environment where nothing urgent needed to happen because everything important was already in place. William followed at a distance, not guiding, not leading, simply ensuring that nothing disrupted the balance that had finally been restored, and as he moved, he glanced once at his phone, messages already stacking, names that carried influence, urgency, curiosity, all reaching out, all trying to connect to something that had already moved beyond them. He silenced the screen without reading further. Not everything required immediate attention. Not everything deserved it. Emily reached the end of the hallway where the master suite opened into a larger private space, and as she stepped inside, the lights adjusted automatically, a soft glow filling the room, warm, controlled, welcoming without excess, and she moved toward the far side where a second window overlooked a different part of the property, darker now, quieter, untouched. She stood there for a moment, her hand once again resting over her belly, feeling the steady movement beneath, the constant reminder that while the world outside shifted and reacted, something else continued on its own timeline, unaffected, certain. "We are not going back," she said quietly, not turning, not asking. William stopped just inside the doorway, his voice calm, definitive. "No," he said. "We are not." And in that moment, the statement did not feel like a decision. It felt like truth. The night settled fully over the property, the last traces of daylight disappearing beyond the tree line as soft interior lighting took over completely, shaping the space into something calm, controlled, and deeply private, and Emily remained by the window for a moment longer, watching as the darkness outside absorbed the details of the garden until only faint outlines remained, a quiet reminder that not everything needed to be visible to be real. She turned slowly, her movements unforced, and walked further into the room, her steps steady against the soft carpet, the environment adjusting around her without resistance, as if the house itself recognized that its purpose was no longer to impress, but to protect. A tray had been placed quietly near the sitting area, a simple meal prepared with care, not elaborate, not performative, just enough, and Emily paused beside it, considering it for a second before sitting down, her body finally allowing itself to acknowledge a different kind of need, one that had been pushed aside for too long. William remained near the doorway, not intruding, giving her space to exist within this new rhythm, and as she took a small sip of water, her shoulders relaxed further, the final layers of alertness dissolving into something more natural, more sustainable. "It feels different now," she said after a moment, her voice low but clear. William stepped slightly closer, his presence still measured. "Because it is," he replied. "What was uncertain has already been decided." Emily considered that, her gaze lowering briefly before lifting again, clearer than before. "And there is nothing left to prove," she added. William inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth in that without elaborating, because the absence of pressure was something that spoke for itself. In the distance, the quiet sounds of the house continued, subtle movements, distant footsteps, doors closing softly, a system functioning without disruption, and it reinforced something that Emily had not fully allowed herself to feel until now. Stability was not something she had to fight for, it was something she could choose to remain within. She set the glass down gently, her hand returning once more to her belly, feeling a small, steady movement beneath her palm, and a faint smile crossed her face, not dramatic, not fleeting, just present, anchored in something real and ongoing. "Everything that mattered is still here," she said softly. William followed her gaze, not needing to ask what she meant, because it was evident in the way she stood, in the way she carried herself, in the absence of everything that had once weighed her down. "Yes," he said. "And it always will be, as long as you protect it." She nodded once, not as agreement, but as understanding, a quiet recognition of responsibility that no longer felt overwhelming, because it was no longer shared with someone who had misunderstood its value. The room settled again into silence, but it was no longer the kind of silence that follows shock or tension. It was the kind that follows resolution, where nothing needs to be said because everything has already been decided. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, unseen but constant, and inside, the world held steady, unchanged by the noise beyond its walls. Emily stood once more, her posture firm, her expression calm, and as she moved toward the far side of the room, the light followed her in soft, even tones, illuminating a path that did not require direction, only continuation. Because in the end, what defined the moment was not what had been taken, not what had been exposed, but what remained, untouched, undeniable, and entirely hers to carry forward without fear. The house had gone completely still by the time the clock marked the late hour, the kind of stillness that did not feel empty but complete, as if everything that needed to happen had already taken its place and nothing was left unresolved, and Emily stood near the far window, the glass now reflecting her clearly against the darkness outside, no longer a faint outline, but a defined presence, grounded, certain. She studied that reflection for a moment, not searching for who she had been, not questioning what had changed, but recognizing what remained, the parts of herself that had never disappeared, only been pushed into silence, and as she stood there, her posture straight, her expression calm, it was clear that silence no longer had power over her. Behind her, the room held its quiet shape, soft lighting, steady air, no sudden movement, no interruption, and William remained just outside the doorway now, no longer watching closely, no longer needing to, because the moment that had required his presence had already passed, and what followed belonged to her alone. Emily placed one hand gently over her belly again, a gesture that had become instinct, not out of protection, but connection, and she felt a small movement beneath her palm, steady, alive, unaffected by everything that had unfolded, and she closed her eyes for just a second, not to escape, but to anchor that feeling, to hold on to something that could not be taken, could not be rewritten, could not be diminished by anyone else's actions. When she opened her eyes again, she did not look at the reflection. She looked forward. The future was not visible in detail, not mapped out, not explained, but it did not need to be, because uncertainty no longer felt like something to fear, it felt like space, space to choose, to build, to move without being pulled backward. Somewhere in the distance, a phone vibrated softly against the table, a reminder that the outside world had not stopped, that conversations were still happening, that names were still being mentioned, that narratives were still being shaped. But Emily did not turn toward the sound. She did not need to. Because for the first time, what the world said did not define what she knew. She took a slow breath, steady and full, then stepped away from the window, her movements deliberate, unhurried, and as she crossed the room, the light followed her once more, soft and even, illuminating her path without demanding attention. At the doorway, she paused for just a moment, not out of doubt, but awareness, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had led to this exact second, everything that had been endured, everything that had been revealed, and everything that had been left behind. William glanced toward her briefly, meeting her eyes, and in that silent exchange, nothing needed to be said, because both of them understood the same truth. Some endings do not come with noise. They come with clarity. Emily gave the slightest nod, then continued forward, stepping into a hallway, into the next space, into what came after, and the room behind her remained exactly as it was, calm, still, resolved. Because in the end, he had lost control of the story the moment the truth no longer needed his permission to exist, and she had gained something far more powerful, something that could not be taken away again. Not his wealth. Not his influence. But the one thing he had never understood the value of until it was gone. Her dignity.